Do you see any near prospect for a ceasefire in Ukraine, given Italy's role in the approaching the 4th anniversary of war?
I see important steps forward. In the documents that we are dealing with, there is certainly a very good job done on the issue of security guarantees for Kiev, which, among other things, as you know, is based on an Italian proposal, which was, let's say, to draw them on the model of Article 5 of the Atlantic Pact. There is work on the reconstruction of Ukraine, which is also well advanced, and there is a peace plan, in which there are also many issues that on paper have been resolved, except that we are very far from resolving the main issue, which is that of the territories, where Russia continues to have demands that in my opinion are absolutely unreasonable. And I believe, as I have said many times, it is important that we succeed in achieving peace, but also that we succeed in achieving a just peace, because clearly when the rules of international law are broken, it builds a situation that can only be more and more chaotic, and it is not in our interest to have such a world.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is trapped as he lacks a sufficient endgame. Putin's war has not achieved strategic objectives. Meanwhile, US-led negotiations to end the war have reached a stalemate. What is known about Putin's self-inflicted issue, and where do negotiations stand right now? Russian dictator Vladimir Putin faces a narrowing set of options as the war in Ukraine grinds on. More than 4 years after launching full-scale invasion, Kremlin has not achieved a decisive outcome, yet bringing the conflict to an end without clear gains carries serious political risks for Putin at home. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, many allies believed Moscow expected a swift campaign that would weaken Kyiv. That did not happen. Ukrainian resistance, backed by Western allies, hardened the front lines. Since then, the conflict has turned into a prolonged and costly war of attrition. Russians hold parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, but they have not secured a breakthrough. Casualties have mounted. Economic sanctions have strained key sectors of Russian economy. While the government has adapted in some ways, redirecting trade and increasing military production, the long-term costs continue to rise. For Putin, the political stakes are high. The Kremlin has framed the war as a historic mission tied to Russia's security. State media regularly describes the war as essential to countering Western influence. After years of such messaging, accepting a settlement that looks like compromise could damage Putin's image as strong leader. At the same time, continuing the war poses its own dangers. Prolonged fighting keeps pressure on Russia's military. It also increases uncertainty about domestic stability. While public dissent remains limited under tight government control, war fatigue could grow if losses continue without visible progress. Diplomatic efforts have surfaced periodically. Western officials have discussed scenarios for ceasefires or negotiating settlements, and there have been indirect contacts between Moscow and Kyiv, but any deal acceptable to Ukraine would likely involve security guarantees and limits that Russia may find difficult to accept. Conversely, a settlement that rewards Moscow too heavily would face resistance from Ukraine and its allies. This creates a strategic dilemma. To declare victory, Putin would need terms that justify the invasion at its cost. Yet achieving those terms militarily appears unlikely, and settling for less risks undermining the narrative, and that has strained for the war effort inside Russia. Some analysts argue that Putin is betting on time, hoping Western support for Ukraine will weaken. Others believe he sees no better options than to continue even without a clear path to success. Meanwhile, efforts to end the war in Ukraine are underway, but the chances of lasting peace remain uncertain, according to The Economist. Diplomatic talks involving US, Ukraine and Russia have taken place in Geneva, aiming at exploring ways to stop fighting. US officials say the meetings are a step forward, but major disagreements remain between sides. Ukraine insists that any deal must protect its independence. Kyiv's leaders reject proposals that would require giving up territory. At the same time, Russia continues to demand political and territorial concessions and shows little urgency to fully commit to a peace settlement. European intelligence officials have expressed skepticism about the chances of a deal this year. They worry that Moscow may be using talks mainly to ease sanctions. Analysts say the situation is complicated by deep mistrust and on both sides. Ukraine fears that Russia could restart hostilities if guarantees are weak. Domestic politics are also make compromise difficult. Ukrainian leaders face strong public opposition to concessions, and hardliners in Russia oppose giving up battlefield gains. For now, experts say peace talks are ongoing but fragile. A lasting settlement may not be possible unless both sides are willing to make difficult compromises, also Russian side. Also, professor of international politics Scott Lucas has shared his assessment of the current state of negotiations in our most recent interview. He says Putin is just buying more time and does not show any willingness to negotiate.
Zelensky's message indicated that there seems to be a working agreement that the U.S. will lead the monitoring mission. So the Americans will be involved in monitoring the ceasefire, but there is still the issue about whether Europeans will be involved in the mission to oversee the ceasefire, presumably because the Russians object to that. And the Russians have said quite clearly they do not want any European troops inside Ukraine. But at least we were getting progress technically in terms of what a ceasefire might look like. But that brings us to the political group, because you've got to get to a ceasefire. And there you quoted the unnamed officials who said that the discussions were stuck. But Zelensky also indicated that there had been very little progress on the political front. He did not name the Kremlin's chief negotiator, Mr. Medinsky. But what he said, I think, was even more interesting and more important, using a couple of rude words, because even though he is posting this on social media, you can tell he is frustrated. Zelensky said, "We don't need any more historical lessons from the Russians." And we know that Vladimir Putin and we know his officials like to go on long-winded historical explanations about how Ukraine is part of a greater Russia. It appears that Medinsky, instead of negotiating on the serious issues, such as the status of the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, such as the security guarantees for the rest of Ukraine, such as the fate of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, instead of actually negotiating on these issues, Medinsky simply went off on polemic, effectively restating the Kremlin's maximum demands. Politically, Ukraine should surrender to Russia. For that reason, whereas the talks were 6 hours, or almost 6 hours on Tuesday, they were only 2 hours yesterday, and they ended earlier than we expected. Another sign that we really didn't get that much progress. Ukraine is saying we still would like to have a third round of meetings in February. Another round of meetings in February. We wait to see what the Kremlin says, but I think at least my expectations are being fulfilled. And that is, you can discuss the military arrangements for a ceasefire, but until the Kremlin gives up its maximum demands, and by that I mean seizing all of the Donetsk region, keeping the rest of Ukraine weak with no effective security guarantees, until the Kremlin thinks it can get those, we will not get progress in these negotiations, because the Russians do not come to the table to negotiate. They come to the table to get Ukraine to surrender.
You just mentioned about President Zelensky's statement. Also, President Zelensky told Axios that Ukrainians would reject any deal requiring them to give up the Donbass region to Russia. You also have pointed out and mentioned about some kind of technical progress in this military group, but how can we make any kind of progress without solving major issues and major divisions between both sides?
You can't. I mean, there's still a value to the talks on the military side, because, if we suddenly got a breakthrough, then the military arrangements are in place. You don't have to go through and discuss them after you suddenly get a ceasefire. So those talks are still valuable. But, politically, there's no movement here. There hasn't been movement politically with the Kremlin throughout any of these talks. Just as in, the much vaunted talks in Istanbul back in 2022, in the spring of 22, that those talks fell apart because the Russians at the end of the day gave Ukraine another ultimatum. They changed the terms. So I think what was interesting about Zelensky's comments were not just saying that we can't give up Donbass without a referendum, which is true. I think it was also the comments that he made on Tuesday, which said, okay, we can't give up Donbass without a referendum. We're not going to give up the Donbass without a referendum. We're not going to give up Donetsk without a referendum, but we will withdraw. So we'll pull back our military forces in Donetsk, the 22% we control, provided the Russians withdraw from the occupied areas of Donetsk. In other words, here's Zelensky saying, look, we will establish a demilitarized zone. And the Americans quite often talk about a demilitarized free economic zone. Zelensky's saying, okay, we will do that. We will demilitarize here if the Russians do as well. But there is no indication from the Kremlin that they will accept that demilitarized zone. I just restate this. It's, for all the discussions on peace talks, what could happen, what the terms could be, if the Kremlin wants all of the Donetsk region, which is very strategic, and the Kremlin is not going to give up the demand for all of the Donetsk region, there will not be an agreement. Because Ukraine is not going to give up that fortified area. Its European partners are not going to accept giving up that fortified area. And Russia is not going to accept having only what it occupies right now.
Meanwhile, U.S. authorities on Thursday evening released Andrew Windsor and formerly known as Prince Andrew Epstein files, and UK authorities have taken him in custody for several hours, intensifying a crisis for monarchy. The detention and questioning of Mr. Windsor, once seen as a dashing war hero for the favorite son of Queen Elizabeth II, was a blow for the monarchy. It was the first time in modern history that a member of the British royal family had been arrested. The last time was in 1649, when Charles I was executed for treason during the English Civil War. Authorities said they had arrested Mr. Windsor on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The arrest came amid reports that former prince had shared confidential information with Mr. Epstein while serving as British trade envoy. Under British law, suspects are often released after questioning and may later face charges. Thames Valley Police, which is carrying out the inquiry, said in statement Thursday evening that the arrested man has now been released under investigation. Mr. Windsor has denied wrongdoing. His representatives did not immediately respond to requests for a comment. In a written statement, King Charles confirmed his brother's arrest. A spokesperson said Buckingham Palace had not been informed before Thursday morning. Police were seen Thursday morning at the estate, the privately owned country retreat for King Charles II in Norfolk. Here's what else to know for this story. Royal response. King Charles said he supported a full, fair and proper process regarding the investigation. Quote, "In this, as I have said before, they have our full and wholehearted support," he added. "Let me state clearly, the law must take its course. Police have not released details about the specifics of the investigation. However, documents released by U.S. Justice Department last month suggest investigators may be examining whether Mr. Windsor improperly shared confidential documents with Jeffrey Epstein." Virginia Roberts Joffrey, one of Epstein's victims, said the financier trafficked her to Mr. Windsor around when she was a teenager, and then he forced her to have sex multiple times. In 2022, Mr. Windsor paid Mr. Joffrey an undisclosed sum to settle a lawsuit filed in New York in which she accused him of sexually abusing her when she was 17. he did not admit to any of these allegations and wrongdoings. And there is a broader orbit. The Epstein files have implicated several other figures within British political establishment. Police are also examining whether Petrol Mendelssohn, a long-time British political operative and former ambassador to US, committed misconduct in public office by sharing sensitive government information with Mr. Epstein. He denies Kremlin wrongdoing. The latest files also reveal that Sarah Ferguson, Mr. Windsor's former wife and the one-time Duchess of York, maintained a long and personal correspondence with Mr. Epstein after his 2008 conviction for soliciting prostitution. That's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and glory to Ukraine.